have a GBA remake theme going on this channel, it seems. Kirby's outing on the NES was a great send-off to the life of the console that saved the video game industry. Colorful, fun, and inclusive with its mechanics compared to many NES games of the time. Kirby was the brainchild of the now hero of the industry, Masahiro Sakurai. Kirby has gone on to be a powerhouse Nintendo franchise, selling millions of games with each release. Kirby games are not meant to break the player, but to encapsulate pure joy and wonder. That said, I would not classify them as baby games. There's plenty enough challenge here for players of all skill levels. Indeed, the game is tailored naturally to varying skill levels in a way that most games struggle to achieve. The GBA version is a fairly faithful recreation of the original, but deviates in some ways to play up the strengths of the Game Boy Advance. To me, the pixel art look of the Game Boy Advance still holds up marvelously. The game has a soft presentation compared to the original and many games in the series. The wider variety of colors to work with gives the game a more varied appearance. And the use of pastels to complement Kirby's pink color gives a more cohesive look to the game. The limited screen size zooms in the presentation, so the backgrounds must be clear, conveying platforms and enemies for the player to interact with. I did occasionally, though, get hit by attacks hidden by graphical effects. Kirby has a lot of animation and charm. He does not fall, landing on his feet like Mario, so he sort of face plants and then just slides and then gets up and goes on. There's just a lot of charm in that. Nightmare in Dreamland tries to pack a lot of elements into its controls with a limited amount of buttons to implement them. Instead of a run button, you have a double tap forward, which will never be my preferred way to run in a video game. But with the dedicated button for sucking in enemies to copy their abilities, I'm not sure where else they may have implemented it. With the GBA's added shoulder buttons, maybe a Mega Man X-like system could have worked. I'm sure that this addition would not adhere to the philosophy of simplicity that the game is obviously striving for. Another thing I noticed is that I often instigated a float unintentionally by holding up on the D-pad or double tapping the action button in the air. Activating the float quickly is a must at times to avoid pitfalls, but it might be a little too easy to activate. It's difficult for me to explain, but I do not feel as in control of Kirby as, say, Mario or Sonic. I think this feeling comes down to how easy it is to accidentally do something in the game that you did not intend. It does not matter much, though, as the game is designed to accommodate the controls. Most people will probably not notice, but my high value for player control sometimes gets the better of me. That said, I really appreciate how the game is able to present diverse concepts without taking control away from the player. Kirby's gameplay is consistent, and there are not a lot of auto-scrollers or ice mechanics to speak of, although there are a few levels. The only time that this mechanic rears his head are during the couple of boss encounters. The lightning boss threw me off because I thought I had to damage him as we rose to the top of the arena. It turns out he's invincible until you reach the top. While not an auto-scroller, this was one of the few times that the game where conveyance of mechanics was an issue for me. I had to die a few times to figure out what I needed to do. Not in a traditional learning pattern sense, but a lack of clear conveyance. Maybe I missed the clues the game was setting up for me. The auto-scroller driller boss is another exception, but the challenge of the boss is not a platforming one. Like most bosses, with the right power-up, you can end the fight quickly enough. These were isolated incidences, however, and the game on a whole rarely introduces a mechanic that limits the player's freedom. Kirby's music is on a whole other level from most games. Shogosaki, which I hope I pronounced correctly, may not have the same name recognition as other famous game composers, but he has some real credits to his name. Starting at Data East and then moving to HAL Labs, his compositions on the GBA are another testament that in the hands of a great sound engineer, the GBA can hold its own in spite of its well-documented limitations in sound. The sound files would be used directly or iterated on for consecutive releases in the series. The happy and upbeat music drives the player forward at all times. It's sort of the music that would make a morning jog a joy, and that feeling of going for a stroll through these environments never lets up through the experience. The game is not hard, but it is more difficult than I remember it being. The best way to describe it is forgiving. failure is not severely punished, which makes the game seem easier than it really is. Checkpoints are common in levels. As long as you have enough lives, you can utilize them. With the right power-up, bosses can be breezed through, but without them, there's still not a lot of trouble. There are a multitude of mini-bosses for the player to face, which break up levels and diversify the game further. But the real magic in the design is the copy mechanic. Almost every enemy Kirby swallows can be consumed to yield a power-up. My personal favorite is the wheel power-up. It is highly situational and not always useful, but the catharsis of mowing down enemies as an unstoppable force is always satisfying to me. I think if it was utilized more often, I would not care for it as much, but HAL shows the proper restraint and builds a few levels around its mechanics. Moves that the power-ups produce feel like they have a slight startup to them. I tend to blast through levels running as fast as I can, and I would see an enemy and try to react too late to damage them, instead losing my power-up. If you take your time, you have plenty of opportunity to see and react to enemies. Making the moves a little quicker would adversely affect the animations, which would remove some of the charm of the game, so I think I see the designer's intent and prefer it set up this way. It is a game where you can run, but you are encouraged to take a jog and enjoy its visuals. The copy abilities are what take the game to the next level. The sheer variety leads to diverse play, which adds replayability. The music and visuals also elevate the experience above its contemporaries. Do I recommend the remake over the original? That's a tough call. I think if you can play both, you should. The NES version has its own strengths and weaknesses, but it absolutely holds up all these years later. Kirby has something for everyone, but for me, I continue to come back to this version of the character. It is so streamlined and perfect right out of the gate that I rarely feel the need to move on to its later titles. The NES original was like lightning in a bottle, and the GBA remake shows the lightning does indeed strike twice.